We begin tonight by looking at racism in Minnesota courts. 1 year ago, the state legislature created the Racial Bias Task Force. Its mission, examine the relationship between minorities and the court system. Following a series of hearings across the state, the task force recently issued a report on what they've heard so far. And as reporter Maureen Willenbring tells us, the stories are not pleasant.
Hennepin County Judge LAJUNE Lange says she has seen signs of racism in the courts during her 7 years on the bench.
There is a common theme, and that is especially African Americans getting arrested on drug charges. And a common complaint that especially the local police departments are going overboard to single out minorities for arrest.
While minorities comprise just over 6% of the general population, they account for more than 50% of the inmate population in Minnesota's prisons, many on drug-related charges.
Is there selective enforcement? Is there selective charging by the prosecutors? What discretionary decisions are being made?
The information that we were able to collect is going to be invaluable when we go to write the final report.
Judge Lange sits on the State Racial Bias Task Force, which is hoping to answer where there may be racial bias in the courts. Drug arrests are one suspected area, Lange says. Welfare fraud cases could also have racial bias.
There are some cases that a disproportionate number of minority people are brought into court. And one of those categories is called wrongfully obtaining public assistance. These are black women primarily who are on welfare, who attempted to work to better themselves and did not report that employment. So they're drawing the welfare check plus their employment.
And they're getting charged with crime?
And getting charged with a felony.
Family issues in the court have raised questions of racial bias. In a state with 6% minority population, about half of the cases to remove children from their homes are with minority families, according to Carol White of the Hennepin County Community Services. She says the county seems to act too quickly to take children away from parents when they are people of color.
And we've had cases where they've kept kids for 72 hours and they didn't have enough reason to take it into court, so they gave the child back to the parent. And that's very devastating to the child and to the parent.
Racial bias could also be the source of some rental evictions. Judge Lange has dealt with slumlords in her courtroom who took advantage of tenants.
In each of the cases, these African American women didn't know what their rights were. They knew that this was not a fair situation in terms of the landlord failing to make the repairs as promised. But for several months they had paid the rent, believing that those repairs would be made. And when they were not made, the landlord did a forcible eviction.
Lange says if the Racial Bias Task Force does its job, people of color will know they are treated fairly in the courts.
Many people of color are acted upon by the system rather than have the ability or the information to use the system as a tool to make things right for themselves.
Joining me now are two additional members of the Racial Bias Task Force. Donna Anderson has been the director of the Crime Victims Reparation Board since May and is herself a victim of crime. Judge Michael Davis sits on the Hennepin County District Court bench. His career includes work as a public defender. I'd like to start with you, Judge. Do you see a pattern involving racial bias against people of color as you sit and do your job every day?
Well, I don't think you can overlook that we live in America. And there is racial bias in America, and it's alive and well in Minnesota. In our court system, we have 5 African-American judges. We're going to have a 6th one tomorrow with the swearing in of Edward Toussaint. And with...
That's out of how many?
Out of 54 judges. That with our increased numbers on the bench, diversity has come to our system, and a number of issues have been raised and are being raised by the Racial Bias Task Force. Discrimination is alive and well in Minnesota, Minneapolis, St. Paul.
Now, we just saw in this report that 6% of the population is African American, yet they're charged with 50% of the crimes. Is that bias, or as some would say, is this because they're committing more crimes? Which is it?
All right. So you understand what the task force has been doing. We've been in existence for a year, but in fact we've been meeting for about a year and a half of getting organized. Situation now, we've had 8 public hearings, and we're going to conclude with 2 more public hearings. And hearing from the public mainly from the minority communities, American Indians, Hispanic community, the Asian American and African American communities, and finding out what the community feels the problems are, because it's so easy for so-called leaders such as myself or Donna that have positions of power to say what the problems are. But what we're going into the communities, finding out exactly what the communities feel the problems are, whether or not it's translation problems, where Hmong people come into the court, or when African Americans are arrested for drug cases and sent off to prison for long periods of time, longer than if you embezzled $1.5 million in this state. So we've gone through hearing testimony, and now we're getting into the hard work, the gathering of the data, statistical data, dealing with the court systems and getting the case data, and doing surveys of judges, lawyers, and attorneys in the area.
Donna, you had a personal encounter with the police, the court system. Can you tell us your story briefly?
I'll try to do that briefly, and people who know me will find this very difficult. I would like to say quickly, however, that I know what's most helpful to people is statistics and numbers and documentation and so on. But from my perspective, it's going to be more difficult because this is the first study that I know of in the country that's been done regarding racial bias in the courts that includes a victim perspective. This is the first task force that I'm aware of that includes victim service providers on the task force. So looking at the experience for people of color who are victims of crime in the courts is a little tougher because we don't keep statistics by race, and we don't have numbers. They don't relate to the numbers of people incarcerated and so on. So it's a little more difficult for us. So when I talk to people about how valuable the testimony and the narratives are, I'm talking specifically about victims of crime. And the other thing is that we aren't out there. We're not going out there to tell you what the problem is. We're looking at public input so that the members of the public will tell us. And briefly, here I go now. Briefly, I have been an advocate for battered women and sexual assault victims in the Indian community since about 1979. I happen to be an American Indian person, and I worked specifically in those communities early on. In 1982, however, I was assaulted in a parking lot in a small town in Minnesota by 3 Indian people. And because, I sustained some permanent damage, and I have a plate holding up my eye and no feeling in the side of my face and so on. However, beyond the trauma of the incident itself was the trauma of getting involved with the criminal justice system, because the night of the assault, police officers came to the scene. The offenders were still there, and they treated it as though, and made remarks about just a bunch of Indians fighting. And they put me in a car with a relative of mine and told her to take me home.
Now, clearly you were so injured that you needed a lot of medical attention.
Yes, well, almost immediately my eyes were closed and my face was busted and my hand was busted and I was covered with blood. But they told my relative to take me home. She took me to the nearby hospital also, and they did the same thing at the hospital. See, we happened to be on a reservation. And most Indian people are used to that kind of treatment by
So what you're left with is the feeling that your life, your injuries are just of less value.
I don't feel that way.
No, I mean, this is the way the system,
that's right.
That was the message that
That's
the system
right.
gave you, rather than advocating for you or trying to help you.
Well, and it wasn't even that so much.
Much less to get justice.
Exactly, so for some equity and some equitable treatment by the system, and these appropriate and the same appropriate response that other people of color expect and deserve.
When you see cases, and as you have heard testimony, is that a pattern, the feeling that my life is just not as valued as a person of color? Is that where the anger sometimes starts? Well,
I've been a judge. I'll be a judge for 9 years starting in February. But I've been in the criminal justice system for over 20 years, and I was a criminal defense lawyer. And it's clear that we don't even have to look at the statistics in Minnesota, but across the nation, that a person of color's life is worth less than that of a white person. And that's nothing new, and it's, but that's what you're trying the fact of life. Yeah.
Through the task force.
Exactly.
Thank you very much for sharing your experiences with us, both of you. Let's turn.